Okay, so this video is really going to sort of, I wouldn't say completely or 100% explain, but help to sort of demystify graded potentials and what they mean for action potentials. And I think a good place to start would be actually a review of the kinds of channels that exist. Because really the difference between graded and action potentials, or graded potentials and action potentials, almost boils down to these things. And I think that probably it would be useful for students to have a review of this stuff anyway, because I find that it's needed a lot. So let's watch as I try to make a table in EpicPen. See how it goes. So first I'm going to make a table. And let's start with so I'm going to flesh out my table by saying this one is the name of the channel or protein. And this one is going to be open conditions, meaning what conditions are necessary for this channel to be open. And notice I didn't say a specific ion here. I just left it as ion channels. And this line isn't straight, which I know is going to drive me nuts. So I'm going to draw it again. There, that's better. So the opening conditions for voltage gated ion channels is a specific voltage range. So for example, so this is going to be the for example column. So for example,
calcium channel in the cardiac muscle.
This one, it could be that, or it also just could be the sodium channels for regular neurons. Your book does this thing where it gives you these voltages in a chart, and it would have you believe that they're all the same for every neuron. That's not actually true. Different neurons have different neurons, and different kinds of ion channels have different sensitivities. But your book glosses over that because you could devote an entire textbook to the kinetics and behavior of ion channels. So they're just like, it's this, because we say so. So in this case, this is sort of the Goldilocks range of voltages for a specific channel to be open. And at any other voltage, it closes. So this gives us, and I'm going to write this over here in a little asterisk. All or nothing. It's a binary system. So the channel is in one of two states. It's either open or closed. If we're in this range, then open. If we're not in that range, then closed. So there's actually a bit of an algorithmic component to this, because an algorithm is really just a series of if-thens. That's what it means. And this is a very specific and narrow set of operating parameters. It's really tidy. So that's why I mean all or nothing. So there's no such thing as a voltage gated ion channel being halfway open, for example. It's open or it isn't, full stop.
That's actually, yes, because my brain wants to be like, well, it's opening. How fast is it opening? And what's it doing at, plus 20? So plus 20 is within the range of it being, it's not just halfway open, it's still all the way open.
Correct. So when you get into the probabilistic nature of it, so like if you read passages in your book very closely, you'll see sentences like beginning at negative 60 millivolts, voltage gated sodium channels are opening. So in this particular table for this row, I'm talking about the behavior of one of these ion channels, when really the ion channels exist in a population of ion channels in the membrane. So when your book says starting at negative 60, voltage gated sodium channels are opening, what it means is the average overall membrane potential being measured from the entire neuron is at negative 60, which is the necessary condition for voltage gated ion channels to open. However, that doesn't mean the membrane is uniformly at negative 60. One part of it certainly is, probably, but neighboring areas may need a little bit more time to depolarize. So when we say ion channels are opening, it means the minimum condition has been met for voltage gated channels to open at one spot on the membrane. And that depolarized spot is spreading, which means that neighboring ion channels are beginning to open also because their necessary voltage has been met. Okay, so let's compare these with ligand or chemically gated ion channels. So the word ligand or ligand, depending on, it's a style choice, you guys. What that means is something that a protein is binding to. So we can also say chemically gated ion channels because ligands are chemicals. So that's what that means. Students get kind of intimidated by that word, ligand, but it's just a name for thing protein binds to. That's all it is. So open conditions for these. If their favorite ligand is in active site, then open. So for example, so if this word is ringing a bell for you, nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are receptors for acetylcholine. So they bind the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. But when that happens, they turn into a sodium channel. So when a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor binds acetylcholine, which I'm going to abbreviate, but these two things are the same thing, it opens and allows sodium ions through. So to add to my table here, and I was an irresponsible table maker and I didn't leave myself enough room, which is classic me, honestly. So now we're
How
going to
does
do.
one truly ever know how big to make their table, though?
That's true. But if I had to count the number of times I've made a table in like Microsoft Word and then been like, oh wow, I made this completely wrong, it'd be so many. So over here, we're going to talk about the style of potential that we're talking about. So you cannot have action potentials without voltage gated channels. So these are action potentials. These ones are graded potentials. And then I have two other categories of channels that I'll mention just really, really quick. Well, actually, I'll just do the one. That makes more sense. And that is, of course, mechanically gated. So these are having the open condition of if they're mechanically distorted. So prior to making this video, I just made a video talking about hair cell depolarization and how the tip link protein pulls the hatch on the stereocilium open. That's an example of a mechanically gated ion channel. If you squish a hair cell, the protein opens and helps the cell depolarize. Or same deal with all of the Pacinian corpuscles that are your deep skin sensors. They're just full of mechanically gated ion channels such that if you are poked, they depolarize. So over here in the for example category, I'll just write baroreceptors are also based on mechanically gated ion channels. So if if the wall of something that's lined with smooth muscle is stretched, that can pull apart the ion channel, allowing ions in. So that's an example. But these are also going to only generate graded potentials. So what I'm going to move on to next is we're going to look at this particular kind of channel to help us understand what a graded potential really is. Because when you read the book definition of graded potential, it says something along the lines of graded potentials are local, they don't travel, and they're variable. And that's really vague. And no wonder students have a hard time understanding what that means, because how could you with that reductive of a description? So what I like to do is use what's hopefully a familiar example by now of a cholinergic synapse, like the neuromuscular junction. So that's just what I'm going to do. Keep that nice and simple. And then I'm going to also, the way that membrane potential is measured is you take a glass electrode and you poke it through the cell membrane. And basically what this electrode is doing is it's hooked up to a computer. It just calculates how positive or negative the inside of the cell is compared with the outside. Which charge separation. So, you know, that little diagram that looks like this, where you've got voltage changes over time or whatever. This diagram that you've seen a million times in 241 that you're probably tired of by now, the way it's generated is this. So that's another thing that I find is not very well explained by A&P textbooks is you see that graph a lot of times and no one ever really explains how it's made, but it's pretty intuitive. And I think if you understand how it's made, that graph makes a lot more sense. So the electrode adds up all the pluses and minuses inside of the cell, and it adds up all the pluses and minuses outside of the cell, and it basically subtracts them, and that's how you get the millivoltage of the membrane potential. So that's where those numbers come from. Okay. So, come on. Being incredibly uncooperative today. Don't appreciate that, Epic Pen. Okay, so I have vesicles of acetylcholine. And actually, let's start out really simple. So in this, 1, 2. Okay, so each of these little guys is a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, and they each need to bind to acetylcholine in order to open. Oh no, there we go. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw myself a graph over here. So the graph is being generated by this electrode. So at starting conditions, I'm going to say my membrane is at -70. Because I'm saying that's resting for this cell. Now I'm also going to say, I'm going to make some rules down here. So 1 acetylcholine receptor needs 2 acetylcholine to open. And each one that is opened equals +3 millivolts. So those are our rules. So now let's say I have this condition. So for whatever reason, my motor neuron is neurotransmitter poor. Nevertheless, it receives an action potential. And that causes fusion of the vesicles with the membrane due to voltage-gated calcium channels at the end, which I should draw, even though I don't want to. So when the action potential reaches the voltage-gated calcium channel, that goes in, that permits vesicular fusion, letting the neurotransmitter out. And so I have 1, 2 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors bound, which means I'm letting in enough sodium. So based on my rules that I've written down here, how many millivolts do I get to go up for this amount of neurotransmitter?
+6.
+6, right? Yeah. So I have this transient rise. So let me give myself a little bit more of an axis over here. So let's see, -65, -60, and I'm going to say -60 is threshold. So I get to go a little more than halfway up to threshold. But that wasn't enough. So once this action potential is done, the membrane potential is going to drift back down to -70 because of what?
Because it didn't reach the particular place that it needed to go to open.
Correct. But
Leakage in sodium potassium pump.
bingo. Yeah. So somewhere off screen, the sodium potassium pump is pumping away, restoring the membrane potential. So both of you are correct. We didn't get to threshold, and the sodium potassium pump is going to restore the resting potential. So this is a graded potential. It didn't spread away from the junction. So for example, I mean, I've been naughty. I didn't draw over here. A short distance away from the junction, we've got voltage gated sodium channels. So that threshold that I circled is the threshold for these. So what we're trying to do is have enough neurotransmitter leave the axon terminus to get enough of these green guys open so that I get up to threshold, and that makes the graded potential open its neighbors. So now that I've had one failed attempt, we call that a sub-threshold stimulus. So the membrane did experience a graded potential. It wasn't a big enough graded potential to reach threshold. So now let's reach threshold, shall we? So I'm gonna make some vesicular fusion happen. So now I have 3, 6, 9, more than enough to get to threshold, right? So this graded potential is going to go up. And that's enough of a sodium influx because sodium doesn't go into the membrane and then just stay here. It diffuses laterally because there's no sodium over in that direction. So that's going to open my voltage gated sodium channels, which are going to begin opening. And then that's enough depolarization to open its neighbors. And so on and so forth, which means that now I get to do my action potential waveform. So both this and this are graded potentials. One of them was sufficient to reach threshold, the other one was not. But graded potentials can cause action potentials. They just don't always cause action potentials. So are you referring to, the question is this for everything minus cardiac muscle? So for cardiac muscle, the pacemaker cells spontaneously depolarize because they're leaky. And
Yeah.
then they provide the stimulus for the other cardiac cells to depolarize. So the pacemaker stimulus is what gets the regular cardiomyocytes up to threshold to depolarize. So it's not quite everything minus cardiac muscle. It's just that cardiac muscle works slightly differently. So before we finish with this, does that help everybody kind of better understand and more confidently understand what a graded potential really is, the mechanics of it, and how it relates to an action potential?
Yes, and if there's time, can you give a couple examples of how you can have presynaptic and postsynaptic inhibitors or exciters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to make a different video for that. So let me pause, stop the video, and get my ducks in a row for that, and then we'll do that too.
Thank you.